Hey, what's up, people? We're back with the vlog for Adventist Youth Ontario, and today we are going to be talking about the church. Here we go. So I've done a handful of mission work in my time in life so far. I've been a couple places around the world, as well as being involved in church locally. There's a thing I've noticed that is really interesting to me, and it's the way that churches in various places use Habakkuk 2 verse 20. It's this really simple passage that says on its own, "But the Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth keep silence before him." And the way this verse is used, I've seen it literally printed on the floor, I've seen it on posters or flyers on the wall, on a stand at the entrance to a church, and this is in different places all around the world. And this verse is used as an encouragement to people to be quiet in church because the Lord is in his holy temple. If you look at it closely enough, this could actually strike you as a misuse of this text, and it got me thinking maybe we need to kind of collectively rethink how we picture the idea of the church and the temple of God, especially in the reality of the new covenant. How do we think of what the temple is and what the church is so that we don't misunderstand what the scriptures are saying? If you look in Acts 17:24, Paul is in Athens, he's talking to the people on the Areopagus, and he tells them very clearly in that verse that God does not live in temples made by human hands. He just does not live in buildings that are made by people, because he's trying to prove to them that God is this transcendent supernatural being who can't be contained by human architecture. He can't be contained by idols and buildings and those kinds of things. Even more interesting than that is in 1 Kings 8:27-29, it's part of Solomon's prayer of dedication for the original Old Testament temple when they actually finally got around to building it. He's giving this prayer of dedication that God would bless the temple. He actually admits at one point that the temple is not even going to be able to contain God's presence. He says, will God actually dwell on the earth? He goes as far as to say, like, basically, God isn't going to really live in this building the way a human lives in a building. There's this general sense that you get from the Bible that, yeah, God is a lot bigger than things we could fit inside of our individual houses on earth. We get that. God is God. He's not confined to physical space the same way we are. So what is going on then? Like, what do we make of this passage in Habakkuk? One of the things that I think is worth noticing, first of all, is that he doesn't say, the Lord is in his holy temple, let everyone who's also in the temple keep silence before him. It says, let all the earth. If you look directly before and after in this chapter, in Habakkuk 2, and as well as in the next chapter, Habakkuk is dealing with the rise and the fall of kingdoms, especially in this case, Babylon and the Chaldeans, and the violence they're inflicting on other nations around them, the pride of these empires and their boastfulness and their greed and their idolatry. And even right before it is talking about the fact that idols can't speak, they can't respond, they can't make sound. And then it goes into this statement, let all the earth keep silence before the one true God who is in his holy temple. So it's this contrast saying, all the war and violence and pride in the earth must be silenced before God's presence. This is much different than taking the passage to mean you have to be quiet in church, because the silence in this Habakkuk passage is not being located to a location that humans are in, it's being applied to everyone in the world, specifically with regards to warfare and violence. And again, what we're trying to avoid here is localizing God's house to a physical location. We understand that our modern church buildings are not directly analogous to the temple in the Old Testament. They serve very, very different functions. Another interesting thought is that there's a rabbi, a Jewish rabbi by the name of Abraham Joshua Heschel, I suppose the late Abraham Joshua Heschel now. In one of his books, it's this book actually, in this book called The Sabbath, he says that one of the reasons the Jewish religion was able to survive after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD was because pagan religions build a lot of sacred places in physical space, and the Jewish religion had this too, but their more sacred space was not a space at all. It didn't occupy physical space. Their holy temple was in time, namely the Sabbath. It's an interesting concept that the Jews have something that's holy that doesn't occupy a physical location. So okay, I've gone on about this for a little bit. Yeah, we understand God doesn't live in a physical space. So what do we think about what the church is? You need to look at Ephesians 2 to see the concept of the church and the temple kind of being used together. And if in the end of Ephesians chapter 2, Paul talks about the church being a group of people who are built on the cornerstone that is Jesus, and together this building is growing together into a temple for the Lord. It's kind of weird to think of a stone building growing like it's something organic. That's a really strange concept to us. But what Paul is doing here is he's painting us a picture of the building, the temple that God actually lives inside of, is made out of his people. It's made out of the church, which is not a building. The church is not a building that you build with bricks and mortar. It's made out of people. The building blocks are people. Even the cornerstone is a person. So what does that mean for us practically speaking? Am I saying it's not legitimate to be quiet in church? No, of course not. Wanting to maintain a certain kind of atmosphere for prayer or reflection or a certain kind of church service, that's fine. That's a practical concern though, not necessarily a biblical one. I think there are enough instances in the Bible where we find people encountering God in his presence, or even visions of seeing him in the heavenly temple, and it's actually pretty loud. What we can do with this is say, okay, if we're the church, how can we use our buildings that we kind of mistakenly call churches in a way that reflects God's honor and glory and has a positive effect on the community around us? I was on a mission trip in Japan. It wasn't with an Adventist group, but the church we were working with, in their sanctuary, they had actually a hardwood floor. For pews, they brought out tables and folding chairs during their Sunday services, and during the rest of the week they could actually remove them and just have this hardwood floor. At one point they actually put on like a day camp program for kids, and so while on one day of the week people would worship in this church in a fairly traditional church setup, the sanctuary that they were in actually could almost turn into a gym. And the thing is, it wasn't Christian kids coming out to this, it was parents from the community dropping their kids off for day camp while they go run their errands, take care of business. The cool thing was, this church had become like a community center. It became a place that mattered to the community that it belonged to because they were using their building to offer a service to people. I think it's funny because in our context, sometimes kids will get ridiculed or chastised for running around and playing in church because it's God's house. The interesting thing is, if you have a biblical understanding of the church, the kids aren't running around inside of God's house. God's house is running around inside of a man-made building. Look at these often very large buildings we have that remain empty for most of the week. We could use these things for a lot of really good community service. We could have cool programs. It would be amazing what we could do with our facilities if we started thinking of them less as places where God is asleep in his bedroom and you better not wake him up, and more like this is just a facility that's being used by the living, breathing temple of God on earth that comes and goes and exists as a reality outside of the walls, even outside of church services. So we have to remember this distinction that God is in his holy temple in heaven, but the reality on earth is not a building. The reality on earth that God indwells is people, a community of people who love each other and care for each other and have a relationship with each other. Respecting God's house doesn't necessarily mean being quiet in church. Respecting God's house is a matter of loving and respecting your brothers and sisters. Do you think something different? Do you want to add something to this conversation? You can leave your thoughts in the comments below. Tune in next week for another video, and if you have suggestions on topics you'd like to cover, leave those in the comments as well. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel, and we'll see you again later. This is Adventist Youth Ontario. I'm Max. Goodbye. Fall off the couch.